The auditorium at Westbridge Military College buzzed with youthful energy. Cadets in sharp uniforms sat in neat rows, chatting, scrolling on their phones, or adjusting their ties while waiting for the leadership seminar to begin. It was a prestigious annual event featuring decorated officers, rising stars, and veterans with battlefield stories that inspired standing ovations. But when Raymond Carter took the stage, the room shifted, not in reverence, more in confusion. He didn't wear a uniform, no polished medals, no booming voice. Just an elderly man in his mid-70s, thin, with slightly stooped shoulders and soft gray eyes. He wore a modest brown blazer, his tie a little crooked, and walked with a noticeable limp. As he reached the podium, his hand trembled slightly. Then he began to speak. "Good afternoon, cadets," he said slowly. His voice was low, gravelly, marked by the slur of someone who had once suffered a stroke. "I'm not here to impress you. I'm just here to share what I've seen." A few students in the back exchanged glances. One let out a soft snort. Another leaned to whisper, "Is this guy even military?" Quiet laughter followed. Raymond continued, undeterred. He spoke of leadership, not the kind you find in textbooks or tactical manuals, but the kind built in the quiet, thankless corners of service, about owning your decisions when no one's watching, about lifting up those who've fallen, not just physically, but morally. His stories were personal, vulnerable. At times his voice cracked, but many weren't listening. Some cadets smirked behind raised phones. A few yawned. One pretended to check his watch in exaggerated fashion. The applause when he finished was polite at best. Light claps, a few standing only because it seemed expected. Raymond nodded once, gave a quiet "thank you," and left the stage alone. He returned to his chair at the far edge of the room, unnoticed, uncelebrated. To most of them, he was just an old man with a slow voice and no rank. They didn't know who he really was, not yet. And in just a few minutes, the entire room would rise, not for the famous keynote speaker, but for the very man they had just mocked. As Raymond Carter stepped down from the stage and returned to his seat near the exit, the murmurs in the auditorium grew louder. No one was cruel enough to laugh out loud, but the whispers were sharp enough to sting. He barely got through it. Why did they even bring him in? Bet he was just some local volunteer. Some cadets scrolled through their phones, barely hiding their disinterest. A few chuckled over a short video one had secretly recorded, just a clip of Raymond mispronouncing the word strategy, then pausing to gather his breath. Meanwhile, Raymond sat quietly in the back row, hands folded in his lap, his eyes gazing forward, not bitter, not surprised. He'd seen this kind of reaction before. He knew exactly how young people viewed him. Outdated, irrelevant, someone from a slower world they believed they had already surpassed. But he hadn't come for applause. On stage, the next speaker was introduced, a highly anticipated name. Colonel Matthew Ellis, a decorated combat leader known for his charisma, precision, and storied battlefield career. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras came out. Every cadet leaned forward, eager. Colonel Ellis stepped confidently to the microphone, looked over the audience, and smiled. "Thank you for that warm welcome," he began. "But before I say anything today, I need to tell you a story." The room quieted. "Years ago," he continued, "I was a private, reckless, angry, ready to quit after a brutal failure in training. I felt humiliated, and I was one signature away from walking out of the military for good." A pause. "And then someone sat down next to me. Not with rank, not with orders, just with a calm presence. He didn't tell me to stay. He didn't shame me. He just told me a story. A story about failure, about picking yourself up without anyone watching, about what leadership really means." Ellis scanned the audience, then turned and pointed to the back of the room. That man was Mr. Raymond Carter. Silence. Some students turned to look. Others blinked in disbelief. "He was my drill instructor," Ellis continued. "But more than that, he was my mentor. He taught me what medals never could. How to stand tall when no one is looking. How to lead when no one wants to follow. How to believe in someone who's already given up on themselves." Whispers turned into stunned stillness. "He's the reason I'm standing here today," Ellis said, voice steady. "And I'd ask each of you to think hard about what you saw earlier. Because if you miss the wisdom in that man's words, maybe the fault isn't in him. Maybe it's in how we've been trained to listen." And then the colonel said it clearly, with intention. "I don't just respect him, I owe him everything. That man is, and always will be, my mentor." There was no confusion now, only realization, and a quiet ripple of shame. In that instant the audience saw Raymond Carter not as an old man, but as the giant he had always been. The air in the auditorium had changed. No longer filled with restless energy or low giggles, it was now thick with silence, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they've made a mistake. A visible shift rippled through the rows of cadets. Backs straightened, eyes dropped, phones were tucked quietly away. At the back of the room, Raymond Carter sat frozen. He hadn't expected this. Colonel Matthew Ellis stepped down from the podium and walked across the stage, slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving the man who had once pulled him back from the edge. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice amplified but gentle, "would you be willing to join me up here again?" Raymond looked startled. He hesitated, gripping the armrests of his chair. A few cadets in the back instinctively stood to help, but he waved them off with a soft smile. With effort, he rose, leaning slightly on his cane, and made his way to the stage. The room stood as one. This time the applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Some cadets clapped slowly at first, unsure if they were allowed to change their opinion so quickly. But when they saw Colonel Ellis standing with his hand over his heart, they knew exactly what to do. As Raymond stepped onto the stage, the colonel met him halfway and extended his hand. "No salute," Ellis said. "Not today. Today I honor you not as a soldier, but as the man who taught me how to be one." Raymond shook his hand quietly. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and emotion he hadn't shown in decades. He wasn't used to being seen anymore, not really seen. The colonel turned to the audience. "What many of you don't know," he said, "is that Mr. Carter served 22 years in the Army. He was never flashy. He never chased promotion. But ask anyone who trained under him, and you'll hear the same words again and again. He listened. He noticed. He cared." He paused, scanning the young faces in the crowd. "And yet today, many of you laughed, not because you're bad people, but because you've been conditioned to value presentation over presence, to look for power in volume rather than in wisdom." Silence again. Ellis looked back at Raymond. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but when I needed someone to tell me I still had worth, it was his voice I heard. It was his words that kept me in the Army. And it was his example that taught me the weight of every decision I would make as a leader. Then, in a moment no one expected, the colonel reached into a small box on the podium. "I've had the honor of pinning awards on soldiers across the world," he said. "But there's one pin I've carried for 20 years, waiting to return it to the one man who truly earned it." He lifted a challenge coin engraved with the words, "Lead with honor, listen with heart." He pressed it into Raymond's hand. Raymond looked at it in silence, then finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I never expected thanks. I just hoped one of you would carry it forward." Ellis nodded. "We did. And now they will." The cadets, once indifferent, were now on their feet, many with eyes full of tears. Some had recorded his earlier speech, this time not to mock it, but to preserve it, to share it. Raymond Carter, once dismissed as outdated, irrelevant, and too soft-spoken, had just delivered the most powerful lesson of the day. Without raising his voice, without demanding respect, and without needing recognition, he had simply been the lesson. After that day, something shifted, not just in the auditorium, but in every cadet who had witnessed the moment. Word of Mr. Raymond Carter's story spread across campus like wildfire. Within hours, clips of Colonel Ellis's speech, especially the moment he called Raymond his mentor, had flooded social media, accompanied by captions like, "The most important lesson wasn't part of the curriculum." Respect isn't loud, it listens first. We laughed. Then we stood. What had started as a forgettable seminar became a defining event in the school's culture. Professors began referencing Carter's talk in leadership courses. Cadets who had once dismissed him now sought him out, asking follow-up questions, requesting a meeting, or simply offering a sincere handshake in the hallway. Raymond, ever humble, accepted their gestures quietly. He didn't gloat. He didn't even bring up what had happened. But those who sat with him after class began to understand what Colonel Ellis had meant. He didn't teach with ego. He taught with presence. One cadet, Sergeant Angela Reyes, later shared during a leadership forum, I judged him too quickly. I thought I was too advanced to learn from someone who spoke slowly and didn't look like a decorated officer. But now I realize I missed the point entirely, and I won't make that mistake again. The administration took note, too. They invited Raymond back, not just for one more speech, but as a permanent honorary advisor to the Cadet Leadership Board. His title was simple: Mentor in Residence. He didn't sit in meetings to direct or correct. He just listened. And when he finally did speak, cadets leaned in, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Colonel Ellis also continued to honor his former instructor. At every event he spoke at afterward, he told the story, not just of the day Raymond changed his life, but of the day the younger generation nearly missed the chance to learn from someone who had already walked the road they were just beginning. "He taught me how to lead," Ellis repeated at one such event. "But more than that, he taught me how to listen." Perhaps the most powerful transformation wasn't in speeches or titles. It was in the way cadets began to treat one another. They paused before judging. They asked questions before assuming. They learned to see before reacting. And quietly, at the center of it all, was a man who had once been laughed at, now respected not because of his rank, but because of his humanity. Raymond's story had become a mirror, and for once the reflection it offered was one that inspired change, not shame. 1 year later, the cadet auditorium at Westbridge Military College looked very different. On the far right wall, just above the Leadership Honors plaque, hung a framed photo of Raymond Carter, taken the day he had stood next to Colonel Ellis on stage. In the photo, his hand clutched the challenge coin, his expression both surprised and deeply at peace. Beneath it, a bronze plate read, "Mentor in Residence," a voice they almost didn't hear, but never forgot. Raymond had passed away that spring, quietly, in his small apartment just off campus. He left no will, no list of achievements, just a simple request that no funeral be held in his name. But the cadets refused to let his legacy fade in silence. Instead of a traditional ceremony, they hosted what they called the Carter Session, an annual gathering where cadets stood and shared the most important lesson they had learned that year. Not from textbooks, not from rank, but from each other. Colonel Ellis returned that year as well. He didn't wear his uniform, just a Navy sweater, jeans, and the same quiet respect he'd always held for the man who had changed his life. As he approached the microphone, he held up the coin again. "I was supposed to give this back to him," he said, "but he wouldn't take it. He said it belonged to every cadet who chose to lead with humility, not noise." Then he placed it in a new glass case on the podium. "From now on," he said, "this coin stays here. And every time you step onto this stage, ask yourself one question. Would Mr. Carter be proud of the way I lead?" The room was silent. No one needed to answer.
If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us. Each day we share quiet moments that remind us what still matters. You can subscribe below to join us.